I'm very happy to introduce Jennifer Howse. So Jennifer works at the Rothney Observatory, which is part of the University of Calgary. That observatory, as well as being used for undergraduate teaching, is heavily involved in education and outreach programs across a wide spectrum of ages and communities and so on. So there's many things that Jennifer could talk about, and when we discussed topics, she said we're doing this really cool way of trying to blend Indigenous learning with science in astronomy. And I said, oh, that would be great. Why don't you talk to us about that? So that's what she's going to do. So Jennifer, it's all yours.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to share my screen now. Okay, there we go. So welcome everyone, and thank you for inviting me. And so I'm, like Douglas said, I am Jennifer Howse. I'm with the Rothney Astrophysical Observatory, and we are located within the traditional lands of the Treaty 7 nations. And when I say admits, we really are right in, we're at a real vocal point within the Treaty 7 lands, and we represent just on the lands that we're on, which is actually located 20 minutes southwest of Calgary, that we do border with Tsuut'ina, with the Stoney, and the Blackfoot Confederacy, right where our location is, and which are also the territorial lands of the Métis Region 3, and that's, I am a member of the Métis Nation. So okay, there we go. So I'm very pleased and grateful to be part of the Wayfinding Under Blackfoot Skies project at the university. And this is also part of a larger project, which is called Convergence. And it's the People of the Land Reach to the Sky project, which is blending of Indigenous programming and exhibits and in our interpretive center on site at the observatory. So I'll get into a little bit more detailed about the project later on, but the core focus is the development of scientific-based exhibits and programs that investigate and explore Indigenous methods of celestial observation and the practical articulation of navigating by the stars. And the core themes center around the convergence of Indigenous and Western science ideologies. So I'm going to start off, and I'm going to be very academic right off the bat, so yay. Who I am is, my family's name is Howse, and we're a Métis group, and we're kind of the genesis of our family comes from a fur trader, Joseph Howse, who came in 1795 with the Hudson Bay Company, and he served as a writer and explorer with the Hudson Bay Company, and he explored right the way across Canada, and he was the first member of the Hudson Bay Company that crossed the Rocky Mountains and went south, and he set up a trading post at Kalispell, present-day Kalispell, and he traded for a season there and then made his way back to the UK to report that it was a very lucrative route to go, but a very dangerous one. So he stayed on with the Hudson Bay Company for a further 5 years, and then he returned to England for good. The interesting thing about him is that he was a linguist. He was a trained linguist before he joined the Hudson Bay Company, and so then he spent his retirement years working on a grammar of the Cree language. And so if you're familiar with David Thompson and his work with the Northwest Company, and what he was to mapping is what Joseph Howse was to language. So unfortunately, even though all of his travels took Joseph Howse through the Howse Pass and down south to Kalispell, he did not have any scientific instruments to record his navigation. And the way he got there was through Indigenous guides. And unfortunately, we don't have a written document of the tools that the Indigenous guides used to be able to show him along this path. And so that's always been personal interest of mine is to try and figure out how people for thousands of years had moved over land and were such very good, excellent navigators, and yet we don't have very much documentation on exactly how that was done. Another interesting thing is that what you're seeing here is the Cree word as translated by Joseph Howse of star. And the interesting thing about that is that the word star within the Cree language is considered an active and a dynamic thing. So there was an understanding that there was the star of in itself was an alive object, as opposed to an inanimate object. It was considered a live object, which I think shows a lot of insight. So David Thompson, he was the one who was able to map out Western Canada, and he used at that time, the brand new technologies around finding longitude and latitude. And he was excellent at that. But what essentially he had done in Western Canada was to place a grid upon the land. And that is very different from the approach that was taken by Indigenous cultures in the past. And so that's where I think to this day there's been this maybe perhaps conflict about the approach about how to live on the land, how to establish ownership of the land. And it's because of David Thompson's grid was very different and very, like I said, very different from anything that the Blackfoot cultures, for example, understood about how to conceive of the land around them. So Indigenous celestial navigation is part of a survival technology. So Indigenous peoples survived and traveled great and extensive trade networks for thousands of years. And this was all done with superior knowledge of wayfinding and navigation. Navigation is the planning of a route towards a destination and what tools and symbols and methods are used to steer you along your path. Wayfinding is an orientation of oneself in terms of where you are within the land and the skyscape. According to Beverly Hungry Wolf in her text, The Ways of My Grandmothers, this is the wonderfully complex survival knowledge that demonstrates an innate connection between land and sky. According to Gregory Kajadi, establishing space and time is actually a cultural practice. And the foundation of Indigenous science is that the context is always important and occurs within a landscape and within a web of interrelationships. Indigenous science encompasses survival technologies and comprehending the 360 degrees of the natural world, including spiritual, community, creative connections, and those technologies that are core to survival. I myself, as part of this project, have done a great deal of listening regards to definitions on Indigenous science. And I'm not prepared to say, as some scholars have said, that it's definitively unmathematical. But where I do see the separation between Western science and or colonial science is the attempt to place a grid upon nature, and in so doing, separate the elements by observing them outside of their context. And that type of approach is unfamiliar to Indigenous ways of knowing and life ways. And why astronomy is such a good opportunity to open up to these perspectives of Indigenous science is that celestial objects move in such a wonderfully regular, predictable pattern in the sky to a much greater extent than any of the other natural sciences. And so this is why I believe astronomy is a compelling and evocative theme to explore Indigenous science. Astronomy is the perfect example of the interrelationship between elements, including natural movements, ebbs and flows, and the interrelationships between land and sky. Also, this is very important, I have no doubt, for astronomers globally, is the issue of the significance of retaining dark skies. It's becoming more and more of pressure from of all of the near Earth exploration, all of the satellites that are being launched recently, some very frightening things of people putting lit up advertisements in space, like there's threats everywhere, and very concerned about saving the wilderness of dark skies. And so one of the reasons why we're involved on these projects is that we want to be able to reach out to people in more diverse ways and help them to find some personal meaning and connections to the sky. So we want to put on astronomy, and hopefully that maybe we'll be able to connect to more people by our understanding of how people connect to land and sky. And so we'd start right at the beginning in Indigenous science, and it's a wonderfully metaphoric way to look at the sky. So you can see traditional skies versus today, and I think that I'm probably preaching to the choir with the group I'm talking to now, and just how important it is to be very considerate about the effects of light pollution on the sky and our ability to observe. So I've been working on this project for the past 8 months, and I've been reaching out to several knowledge keepers, and I have not had much luck with finding a great deal of information related to wayfinding, or specifically Blackfoot wayfinding. Knowledge related to astronomy and celestial motion is not only cerebral, but it's also innate. So navigation skills per se were part of lifeways and survival, but they were not conceived as a separate concept. And therefore, in today's dynamic world, it's difficult to find someone who can navigate via the stars, especially when we have such convenient tools at our disposal. It's very easy to lose that ability to look up in the sky. Very simple, where's the sun? What time is it? How many people do that still, especially children, to even understand what that means? And so I am concerned that perhaps some of the specific knowledge about traditional land-based navigation might have been lost to time. And a great example for this, I do have a lot of school-age children that come to the observatory, and I talk about the movie Moana and how Moana was involved in navigating using the stars, and it was open water navigation. And there's a ship, if anybody's was following this, but there was a ship that, and I guess that was about a year ago, they docked back in Honolulu. And the name of the ship is Hukalea, which means welcome star. And that's actually the traditional Hawaiian name for Arcturus. And Arcturus is a very key symbol and a wayfinding star within traditional Polynesian wayfinding. And so I talked to kids about what that means and how Moana was able to find that information. And kids love the story, they love the songs. And what I would like to do is to be able to find more of that concrete information, but on some of the Indigenous cultures here in Canada. And so that's one of the things that I've been working on. So according to David Peat, who is the author of Blackfoot Physics, the Western concept of science is investigating only things that are independent of particular human subjectivity, independent of human values and meaning, and that in itself is a culturally specific enterprise. And this kind of detachment from human concerns, specifically characteristic of Western thought, to from 1600 to the present day, is it's this separation. And I think that where we get into trouble is a lot of times is that we do this comparison thing where there's a thought, well, this is the way things are thought in Western science. So then there's always this search for some sort of equivalent in Indigenous science, and those equivalents just aren't there. It's a different approach. And there's also a different worldview, so that you're not necessarily going to find a direct equivalent between the two disciplines. So according to Pete, we do have a picture of an alternative in which human concerns, emotions, and senses are not seen as irrelevant distractions to be screened out. But in Indigenous science, that these are essential parts of a dynamic universe is to see everything within its context. So my approach has been to take a closer look at the topic from these different perspectives. And I've been listening and understanding the preservation and transfer of knowledge as it relates to astronomy. This knowledge takes the form of architecture, stories, art, songs, dances, ceremonies, and human expression. For example, the movement of rocks across a landscape to derive a tangible link between land and sky is a wonderful way to look at how Indigenous people had traditionally made these connections. Over time, observations can lead to predictions, and forecasts of cosmic movements make time. And so what you're able to do then is make very legitimate political forecasts on what's happening in the sky, and then that gives you power on land within your community to be able to say, okay, I've built this, this structure. I can follow the regular patterns in the sky, and because I have been so good at following those regular patterns, I can start saying that the sun is going to be in a particular location throughout the year, or particular star rises, and that makes you a very powerful person within your community. And that renewal of these cosmic movements, seasonal transformations, and migrations of humans back and forth, creates these wonderful cycles that can be predicted and understood. And then that knowledge could then be shared and passed along from generation to generation. And so looking at medicine wheels specifically, you can actually see some of these spatial connections between land and sky. So medicine wheels are a part of plain culture for over 3,000 years and have been identified in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Colorado, Montana, North Dakota, and Wyoming. And most of the wheels have been found in colder climates and have a central cairn. And it's not a mistake or an accident, but the average number of spokes that you can find are 28, which of course fits very nicely with our understanding of the lunar month. So you can see that there's a central cairn, and then you have those spokes flowing out from the center. The diameter can be as large as 60 yards, and the central cairn is 3 to 4 feet high to 10 feet wide. The Bighorn medicine wheel is dated to over 3,000 years ago and is located in Sheridan, Wyoming. So these are sacred sites and are very significant because of their tangible connection between land and sky. I'm also very grateful that although there is thousands of years of tradition here, but there also a medicine wheel is a very prominent symbol within contemporary Indigenous culture of spiritual symbolism. And so the medicine wheel, the shape, the size, how it's laid out, does indicate some connections between land and sky, but where it gets problematic is what does that mean, and trying to look for very specific, accurate representations. That's a challenge. It's a challenge because essentially you're looking at rocks over land, and when they were moved there, how they were moved. There's always a lot of big questions around that, and actually to find out that archaeological proof is quite a challenge. So it has been taken on, this issue has been taken on by a few researchers. This is the work that was done by Jack Eddy. And what he was able to look at is star rise. So once you've established your medicine wheel, establishing first of all your east-west line, a very simple thing, you can do that within a few hours. And then over time, you'd be able to establish your north-south. And then a period of a year, then perhaps you can also find your star rise. Where it gets complicated is that, of course, you need, so when you're at your location of your medicine wheel, is that you need a point, a convergent point where you can use that as your marker of when the star or moon or whatever it is that you're observing is passing. And when you do go to these locations such as the Bighorn medicine wheel, is that it's difficult to try and establish what was the original distant marker, if indeed there was one. And archaeologists, like I said, it's a very difficult process, and that the evidence in many cases just simply isn't there. But this is an attempt by Jack Eddy to try and see if there is it a possibility, and how could these medicine wheels have possibly been used. So this is the theory of a medicine wheel being used as an actual observatory is actually not held by too many archaeologists. Like I said, it's very difficult to prove that and find that direct evidence, especially when you cannot pinpoint the exact date when the medicine wheel was created, and then what epoch, where were things in the sky, so that you can make an accurate measurement to try and determine if indeed this space was used in that way. It's a difficult process to be able to prove when those rocks were aligned and what they were aligned with. And so I think that where it gets very problematic is that you do have some individuals who've tried to infuse medicine wheels with more hope for meaning that is not necessarily based on evidence. However, from my investigations from elder teachings, medicine wheels are indeed markers and tools for wayfinding, and they mark a path for hunting and gathering and moving over the land. And there are also deeply spiritual connections between the land and the sky. The Bighorn medicine wheel, for example, was a sacred site, and they did find very close by a quarry of buffalo stone. And buffalo stone is a sacred object that would have been used in ceremonies. And so there's your archaeological evidence there that the medicine wheel was actually used as a sacred site. So over the course of my investigations in this, I was trying to find different type of culture representations of connections between land and sky. So I just talked about medicine wheels, and what this is, what I'm showing you now, this is actually a winter count. And a winter count is a gathering of historical and significant events from solstice to solstice. And so just by the fact that they're from solstice to solstice makes them astronomical in nature. These events are articulated through a series of interrelated pictographs that are bound together by astronomical parameters. An elder is entrusted with the memory of these historical events throughout the year, and this elder was the one who traditionally created the winter count. And this elder also served as the tribal historian and astronomer. So a wonderful example of this is found in this, it's actually a direct reference that's found about the winter count that was occurred in 1834. And this winter count depicts an event known as Stars Fall Down, which may relate to a particularly intense meteor shower. So according to Mary Egremont-Molnar and Lavina Manyguns, the Blackfoot winter count of 1834 contained the story of an incident where a medicine man called Bull Got Lift was attacked and killed. And at the moment that he was killed, the moon was no longer seen in the sky. And in the sky, all the stars looked like they were falling down or jumping into each other. And it stayed that way for nearly 2 days. So I want you to imagine that there's this wonderfully dark sky due to a new moon phase and a very active meteor shower. And to imbibe the significance of this very important community member passing away in this very dramatic event, that they linked it to the drama of what was happening in the sky with a meteor shower. And so this is another layer of a historical record that blends important events with astronomical knowledge and threads of information that show how significant the sky was to Indigenous lifeways. So ropes are also significant objects and also were used to tell stories metaphorically. And the decoration on this Kainai robe involves the detail of Ursa Major asterism. And the pointer stars contain not only the physical connections to the stories, but also tools of wayfinding. So this timeless tool of communication, the symbols within the robe design is layered with meaning. And we see the placement of the stars within the asterism from the perspective of the maker of the robe, but also how the asterism was observed in the sky and what relevance the asterism had to the observer. Ursa Major is also a prevalent design and symbol on teepees, many teepees, and the teepee of in itself, the structure itself is an embodiment of land and sky connection. So you'll often see at the top of a teepee that you'll see Milky Way symbolism in the very top design, and then the symbols that flow down to where you see at the very base of the teepee design is often a direct links to something found around, you know, whether it's they call them prairie balls, and what they are is it's just some grasslands that are normally grow in the prairie area, and that's the design that's on the base, and that leads all the way up to the top, which is often depicted with Ursa Major. And so the teepee lodgepole, or the main post of the teepee, is also astronomical in its traditional placement. Is a teepee's opening is always placed to be looking at the rising sun in the eastern sky. And in that way, as the teepees were placed throughout the year, moved from encampment, it's also followed where the sun was rising depending on the time of year. And so in that way, the placement of the teepee is always astronomical. So you can see here some other objects of material culture that also create tangible records. These are multi-layered, multi-generational stories are told using these objects, and the object becomes meaningful with the telling of the associated story. So for example, the necklace that you're seeing here is linked to the story of the 6 lost boys, and who were raced up a tree, and they created the asterism Pleiades. And so the shield also relates to that story, and you can see that there's 6 feathers in the design of the shield. And I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with the story that the 6 lost boys were chased by a bear, and the bear was actually their sister had turned into a bear. It's a long story. And so the sister had turned into a bear, and then she chased those boys, and then they scampered up a tree. And so when you look at Pleiades in the sky, you can imagine that there's tree branches and that there's boys perched on all of those different branches in the sky. And so it's certainly a story that resonates very well with the kids that come and visit the observatory. They love to think about that when they look up. So the objects such as the shield could be used in storytelling and relaying scientific knowledge through metaphor. Shared beliefs include a multi-layered universe with interconnected beings and the need to achieve harmony and maintain balance. These cosmological symbols and principles are the foundation of many of the Indigenous designs. And another areas where you can see this, and there's lovely depictions of stars and constellations and asterism also in beadwork. So the Milky Way is always a powerful symbol because the Milky Way is used as a wayfinding tool. And there's a few different stories. One is that the buffalo herds traveled from the Milky Way. They followed that path down to the surface of the earth. And so navigation was fundamental to a hunter-gatherer lifeway, and the shifting position of the arm of the Milky Way galaxy in relation to the horizon was a very important indicator of direction and time of year. In Blackfoot tradition is where the galaxy of the arm meets the horizon is the trail of the buffalo, and it marks where the buffalo moved from the sky to the earth. And this is a deep tradition now. The fun story that I hear with that sometimes, I think it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, is that some of the Cree stories, traditions are around that it was actually women came down that path too. So whether it's buffalo or women, I think it depends on your cultural association. So this is quite a deeply rooted Milky Way tradition, but it's at its heart, it is quite scientific, and it was very important to survival technologies. And also back to an earlier point that I was making about dark skies, is that I did have a group of inner-city schools from Calgary, community close to downtown of Calgary, and they got to come out to the observatory. And some of these kids had never seen the Milky Way before. If you could imagine that. You think Calgary, it's not that far to drive out of the city, but they just hadn't had that chance. They're surrounded by light pollution all the time. And so they were quite in awe to be able to see the Milky Way overhead and see very clearly some of the stars, planets we got to see that night. And they were thrilled. And but all I could think of is what an unfortunate loss of connection that these kids had to the natural world, and what would compel them to protect the natural world if they hadn't seen it or they didn't quite understand it for themselves. So this is, we actually work with a few amateur astronomers at the observatory who are excellent. And this one particular image here is, we're seeing Venus in the sky. And this is Larry McNish, who's taken a few pictures of iridium flares back in the day when you could do that. And so the reason why I'm showing this is that I wanted to talk a little bit about Venus. There's some interesting stories about the morning star, which is Venus, and the significance in Blackfoot culture. So I've worked with a few elders. One of them I'm very grateful to have known. He was a Kainai elder, and his name was Louis Soup. And he shared with me this story of the morning star, of sisters who were out berry picking, and they looked up in the sky and they saw Venus in the sky, beautiful Venus. And one sister said that she was going to marry that star. So the other sister said, as sisters do, "That's crazy talk. You can't marry a star. What are you talking about?" And she said, "No, I'm going to do that. I'm going to marry that star." So he heard this. The star heard this and came down to her and said, "I would like to marry you too." So it was decided. They were married, and she joined him up with the sky people. Then they lived very well. In the sky people, her community of people lived still well on the earth, but she lived with her husband in the sky very happily. But he did tell her one thing. He said, "You see that turnip over there?" And so she said yes. And he said, "See that turnip?" He said, "You must promise me that you never pull up that turnip. You just leave it in the sky, in the clouds." And so a period of time went by, but her curiosity got the better of her. So she pulled up that turnip, and it left a hole in the clouds, and she was able to look back down and see her community of people that she'd left behind below. And she realized how much she missed him. All of her people, she missed them so much. So she went to her husband and said, "I'm sorry, I miss my community too much. I'd like to go back to them." So he let her go back. And as a gift for their time together, he gave her the white elk dress. And he also gave her the gift of the Sundance. What's interesting about the Sundance is that actually it's not linked to the solstice. The Sundance is a annual ceremony, and there's many other factors. Has to do with moon phases and weather, and there's so many other factors, but not necessarily linked to the summer solstice. But I gave you a very condensed version of the longer version that was as told to me by Louis Soup. But within that story is very interesting is that you can, if you listen very carefully to the description of the morning star, it's understood as a single object. So meaning that you could, sometimes you see it as in the eastern sky, sometimes you see it in the western sky. And where that interesting is that, say, for example, the ancient Egyptians thought of it as two objects, but careful observation and tradition within Blackfoot culture saw it actually as a single object, just observed at different times, a different part of the sky. So this tradition that I was learning from Louis Soup reveals a method of teaching through metaphor that explores astronomical and cosmological concepts, but it requires the listener to comprehend the interrelationships of these concepts and how they fit within the narrative. And the listener is required to conceptualize the meaning and the connections. So there's some scholarship around here. This, I was very fortunate to actually go to a talk, Gregory Kajati, he came to the University of Calgary and he did a talk for us, and it was wonderful. And his work is called Native Science. It's an excellent resource for anyone who's interested in this field. And he, gets into a lot of the philosophy of what we're trying to do and the blend of Indigenous with Western science. And it's both in traditional ways of knowing and contemporary perspectives he covers within his text. And he is a professor at the University of New Mexico, and I would certainly describe him as a trailblazer in this area. So one of the things that he talks about is that the story is the medium because words and listening are living the story. And so what he's trying to do, one of his big messages is that in the pursuit of science, it's also a search for reality. So another scholar in this area that you may or may not have heard of, he's doing a lot of really wonderful work with the Manitoba Science Center, and his name is Willard Buck. And he's a Cree astronomer. And according to Willard Buck, native science is a metaphor for tribal processes of perceiving, thinking, acting, and coming to know all that has evolved in human understanding of the natural world. And so Willard Buck has just recently published another work on identifying Cree constellations. It's a very painstaking and difficult work that he's doing. He's trying to recapture some of the significance and meaning of constellations of wayfinding in northern Canada. And like I said, some of it's difficult because it's knowledge that may not be considered as a separate concept, or even, and more unfortunately, that some of the knowledge may have been lost over time. So what the observatory is working on right now. So this is a picture of the observatory, and this is the view from my office, which is quite lovely. So as you could imagine, with all the things that have been happening with the pandemic, that the University of Calgary was closed, like many universities were closed for the 3-month period. And so I was just able to go back to the observatory in this past couple of weeks. So I was very happy to be back again and to be able to see that view once again. So we are working on a project right now, and it's creating programming that blends the traditional Blackfoot ways of knowing with Western understanding of astronomy. And these are programs that are designed for school-age children, but also this is something that's a little bit unusual for us, that we're going to be creating adult programming around it, so that visitors will be able to come out and actually, we're going to get them to engage in some of the practices of being able to find wayfinding themselves, how to use constellations as a guide. And so we'll see how it goes, because it's then there's this new layer, this new way of doing things now that with the new processes for health and safety that we will have to also include in our programming. So I have been working with some undergrad students and elders, and that's gone very, very well. I've been able to reach out to a lot of people. There's a lot to learn, a lot to know, and there's other observatories, and off the top of my head, I can't remember the name, in Eastern Canada that are also doing this work as well. So we've been able to do sharing some knowledge, which has been terrific. There's a conference that happens once a year in the spring called Think Indigenous, and it's Indigenous educators get together at a conference in Edmonton at the Enoch Cree Nation. And so I was able to present one of their conferences, but I'm really looking forward to going back again and getting a chance to meet with more of these teachers and find out what they're looking for. So this is a group of kids that have come out to the observatory. These are students from the Tsuut'ina Nation, which is one of our border nations, and they're putting together telescopes, which is something that we do. Talk a lot about light and optics. And then this is a whole boring slide, but it's all of the things that we're trying to accomplish with our Convergence project. And so since we are close to the public, this has been actually a great opportunity that we're able to update our exhibits and actually our approach to how we're going to be programming at the observatory. And so we're just going to be meeting with some Indigenous artists tomorrow, as a matter of fact, are going to help us to create some art installations that will demonstrate that land-sky connection that I've been talking about. So, and then as you probably are aware that this is something that's very important for CASCA to respond in a very thoughtful and respectful way to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And this is certainly the project that we're working on at U of C is certainly cognizant of that. And that's something that we're aware of and working on as well ourselves. Okay, and so this is a Google Drive. This gives you our latest programs that we have up. We are also working on this project with partners, and that's the Annan Standing Cross Conservation Area, which is a nature preserve that is about 5 minutes up the road from us, and they are a dark sky nocturnal preserve as well as the observatory. So we're all about dark skies, and we're all about making those connections with our surrounding community to ensure that everyone's included in our perspective of the night sky. So if anybody had any questions or comments, I'd be happy to hear them.
Right. Thanks very much, Jennifer.